I'm going to stand up because I can't sit down and talk. Anyway, welcome to the Warehouse 13 panel. We are a small but mighty fandom. But anyway, my name is Quinn, and this is Gillian.
Hello.
Between us, we have, I figured out the other day, 25 years in various fandoms. I started out in Ender's Game and Wrench. She started out in Discworld and Daria and
A bunch of small crap.
yeah. I also, in my everyday life, have been a historian and a legislative aide. So I personally love Warehouse because of all of the history in it and the way they take the history and make it interact with the show itself. And that's pretty much what we're going to focus on today. Some of the artifacts and how they focus in history. Just a warning, this is not spoiler-free. We are going to be discussing a couple things from Season 5. So, unfortunately, if you haven't seen Season 5 and you don't want to be spoiled, sorry. But anyway, other than that, I think one thing I find interesting to note, as far as I can tell, there are only 2 or 3 things that they made up completely whole cloth with no historical basis to them. One of them is the record from the Season 1 episode. Resonance, thank you. I'm bad at episode names. Anyway, the record from Resonance, I can find no indication of that guy actually existing. However, there are a lot of guys like him. The other thing is the prison. There is no prison that is made out of quartz, as far as I can tell. Would be cool, but there isn't. So everything else has a historical basis. Everything comes from somewhere. And when we get to the second part of the artifact theory, that does actually work with the artifact. So, next slide. First and foremost, these are our 13 warehouses. This information actually came from Sci-Fi's website. I don't know if it's still up, but each of these warehouses from the beginning, founded by Alexander the Great in Macedonia, moving to Alexandria. We all know Warehouse 2. 3 is the original Roman Empire in Rome itself. The Huns are very, very interesting. The Huns were a nomadic people, very nomadic. They had no centralized base. So if you can imagine the warehouse moving from place to place with the Huns, and also with the dates there, the very short amount of time, that was just Attila the Hun. Once Attila the Hun died, the entire Hun Empire fell the F apart. And then they're just, it destabilized, and then they had to move to Byzantine. Byzantine Empire, on this area again. Cambodia, Cambodia, probably in the Angkor Wat area. Gorgeous area if you ever get to see pictures of it. Mongol Empire, now the Mongols also were nomadic, but they did have a home base. There was a spot that they kind of wandered around, so Warehouse stayed in one place. Holy Roman Empire, even though it says Romans, that would have been Germany. Ottomans, Turks, back to Constantinople. India, Russia, beloved Warehouse 12 in London, and then current Warehouse 13 in South Dakota. So, first, we have a little bit about some of the earliest artifacts that are talked about in the show. The first snagged artifact, not necessarily the first chronological made artifact, is the Minoan Trident. Minoan civilization, comes from Crete. And if you know kind of the labyrinth, it's that civilization. There's also an indication that it had connections with Poseidon. Now that brings up an interesting thing. There are a lot of things that are mentioned that have connections to mythological figures. There's this trident, there's Tower of Babelstones, the Salt Face, Joshua's trumpet, biblical and other mythologicals. There's also the statues of Hera and Zeus. Also in the background of one of the shots, you can see Mjolnir. So the question is, are these things actually from these mythological figures, or did they come to power because of sorry, because of the cult of personality surrounding them. Nobody knows. Take your own theory. The other one, the Pompeii Amphora, the floor is made of lava. I mean, how cool is it we have a canon where we actually have the floor is made of lava? Pompeii, in case you don't know, it was a volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius in ancient Greece. And it covered the town, and archaeologically it was found a bunch of years later, and everybody was in ash. It was kind of gross, but anyway, Pompeii. Then we have the spine of the Saracen, ugly looking lobster thing. Now, I actually had to look this up. A Saracen was a contemporary of the time term for Muslim, and it actually was not very nice. It was, if you happen to know, I mean, it was basically just a racial slur. Apologies, but at the time it was what they called people. And I'm going to bounce it over to her. She knows more about the First Crusade than I do.
Okay, the mention of the 11th century exhibit that the spine fell out of on the show is kind of weird because the First Crusade was called in 1095, which is the tail end of the 11th century. So it's like, okay, did the show have slightly weird numbers there, or is this a thing where the spine did exist and maybe the Arabs had trouble because a lot of their best people kept dying because they were using this thing, and so the Europeans won, because the only crusade that the Europeans actually won, took Jerusalem, did what they came to the Holy Land to do, was the first one. After that, they kept losing and occasionally fighting other Europeans.
Which is, never a good thing. Anyway, the crusade itself was getting Jerusalem back for the Europeans. So then we have the Enlightenment. I know I skipped a couple centuries. Sorry. 15th to 18th century. I pulled out a couple of interesting folks from this. Francois Villon, I'm sorry, I'm butchering the French. This is the inkwell that Artie uses in the episode with the...
Lovesick.
Thank you. This is the inkwell Artie uses in Lovesick. He flings it against the wall, and Claudia tosses the artifact through it. He was, as Artie says, a poet and a thief. Half of his poetry actually is about getting in trouble and being a thief. Kind of weird. But anyway, he's an interesting character. He was 1400s. Benjamin Franklin's lightning rod and the ring. Interesting thing in the artifact theory department, because it shows that one person can make multiple artifacts. Ben Franklin actually made a number of lightning rods historically. He was a scientist and a writer and all around interesting character. Slept with Adam Terrace. That's the point. And then we have Alessandro Volta, the lab coat that stuck Claudia to the ceiling. Volta himself, you might know him because he is the person that the volt was named after. It's a unit of measurement of electrical power. He actually came from Franklin. He read some of Franklin's works, and then he took Franklin's electrical theories and enhanced them. He made the first battery. So, and Lucretia Borgia. Lucretia Borgia is an interesting thing. In the show, they portray her as this seductress and temptress and machinator, but the question, she slept around a lot. She had 3 husbands. Her first marriage was annulled. Second one, he died, and then she died in childbirth on the third one. But there is actual historical question whether or not she was very complicit in all of the political machinations, but she did sleep around. Redicus. I admit this one is kind of a pet thing for me. My favorite character is Joshua. But anyway, Redicus was an actual person. When I first saw the episode, I'm like, okay, they made this jerk up. No. Redicus was an actual mathematician in the 15th century. There's his name. Again, it's French. I don't know French. He was the only student of Copernicus. Copernicus did a lot of astronomical theories. He studied trig math and astronomy. His books on trigonometry are actually some of the basis, in addition to some other people, of modern trig. He wrote about the conflict between math and, not just math, why did I say math? Science and religion. So he was a real guy. I really don't think he had a boyfriend, alas. But he was an actual historical figure. 19th century. Now, my time periods are getting smaller, because as we get more into the modern time, there are more and more mentioned artifacts. That does not necessarily mean there are more artifacts. It just means that the earlier times there's not as good of records as there is for the later ones. James Braid was a hypnotist. He actually hypnotized people. He was a surgeon. He thought that the hypnosis would not supplant modern medicine, but it could help. Edgar Allan Poe, everybody knows about Poe, amazing author. And weird ass fact about Poe, he was found drunk in a ditch by the side of the road, dead. And there is a theory that he might have died of voter fraud, because at the time they paid people to go from polling place to polling place to polling place to vote, and that's kind of what they found him doing. Poor folks. Donner Party. What was the date? I have on it. Oh,
It's still configuring.
Anyway, Donner.
1950s?
Something like that. Anyway.
19th century.
I'm sorry, I'm terrible at dates. Anyway, the Donner Party was a group of people that were trying to get over the mountains, but they got stuck in a snowstorm, and rumor has it that they ended up eating each other. Some of them to the end did not. It actually said that they did not commit cannibalism, but they. 48. Thank you. Nikola Tesla, inventor of part of the warehouse and the Teslas. He was a very, very fascinating figure in history and science. Came up with all kinds of things, from various kinds of current to a death ray. Yeah, but he historically was at the World's Fair in 1893, when the Teslas were supposedly picked up.
If I can interject,
Go right
an
ahead.
interesting fact about the 1893 World's Fair, they awarded the lighting contract to Tesla, so Edison said, well, fine, you can't use my light bulbs. So Tesla invented light bulbs for the World's Fair.
Because anyway, last one on this list, we have Beatrix Potter's tea set. Beatrix Potter, as we all know, is well known for things like Peter Rabbit, all the other books, but she did actually study mushrooms, like the show says. She wanted more to be known for her fungal work than the cutesy little kids' books, but who wants to know about fungus anyway? So, I mean, fungus is cool, but. And then we have H.G. Wells. I feel like Helena deserves an entire slide of her own. I mean, first, the other thing too is kind of a progression of what the show has done with history. We started with the spine, which is something that could possibly have been there. Then we moved to Redicus, who was there, but little tweaks here and there. And then we have Helena, which, the heck with it all. Actual H.G. Wells, no, that's not Charles. That is actually H.G. Wells. He was an actual author, as we all know, prominent historical figure, author of science fiction novels, and noted socialist. Also, interestingly enough, if you know H.G. Wells' works, many of the things that Helena talks about making in the show have ties into various ones of the novels. Time Machine is obvious. You say that the interceptor vest could come from Invisible Man, the work with amino acids for Dr. Moreau, Cavorite, etc. So, I want a man. All right, and now we have plenty of things from the 20th century. The 20th century is, by and large, the largest era that the warehouse has been drawing artifacts from. And she's my Titanic expert.
Yes, pretty much everyone knows the basics of the Titanic. Very large ship moving too fast in icy water, got several warnings, kept on anyway, hit an iceberg, disaster. And I think a lot of the interest that's still built up around it is partly it took them so long to find what was left of the wreckage, and partly just this whole maiden voyage, cannot sink, oh, it sank.
My heart will go on.
And one of the interesting things about the piece of driftwood is specifically that it induces hypothermia, because it is actually a fact that most of the victims did not die of drowning. They died of floating in 30-degree seawater for hours on it. So it was the hypothermia that killed them, not actually drowning.
There you go. Rosalind Franklin, one of the poor forgotten figures of history. She appears with the DNA sequencer in the same episode as Bjorn, actually. And she actually was the first person to discover the double helix of DNA. Watson and Crick took her research and expanded upon it and got more recognition than she did, but Rosalind Franklin was really the first person to do it. And I bounce back to you for Man Ray.
Yes, Man Ray was very prominent in the late 20s, early 30s, into the 40s. He died in 76. So Artie saying it was one of his last cameras is a little bit fuzzy timeline-wise, especially since they later said it was active in the early 60s, enough that they were going to send Rebecca and Jack, even though it was actually Pete and Micah, out after it. And my personal theory with the camera is that he had to know what it did when he gave it to that guy, because the guy was into surrealist photography. He would have figured that out somewhere along the line.
Matahari stockings I actually had to throw in here because the snag was in Hartford.
Yay! Yay! The skyline.
Matahari herself was a very interesting figure. She was an exotic dancer and a well-known figure in the early 20th century. She was a German spy, and she was shot by firing squad for being a spy. And she, at the time, maintained her innocence, but they found papers later on that said she actually was a spy. She supposedly used the stockings to help her in her work, which possibly also included the bedroom. However, Artie did make a comment that he wasn't sure if the stockings worked on her or she worked on the stockings. So, how a pair of those right there. Finally, on this page, we have the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory doorknob. Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was a building and company in New York in the
Early 20th century.
early 20th century.
The fire was 1911.
Sorry, my dates are on a computer that decided to reboot. Anyway,
Now,
but so what happened was it was a sweatshop, and there were 150 some odd people, 150 plus people in there at the time, and it's caught on fire. And because the owners of the factory were jerkwads, they had locked the doors to keep the workers in, and basically what that means is they all died in there. One of the biggest working tragedies in history, and the doorknob comes from that. And here we have our spoilers. Frances Farmer's music box, as found by Claire Donovan. Frances Farmer was an outspoken actress in the 30s. She was in and out of mental institutions at the time. She was an early victim of electroconvulsive therapy. some really bad psychiatry and just finally, eventually, she calmed down. However, she was known for her angry outbursts and violent behavior. So Claire's own personal tornado makes a lot of sense when it comes to Frances Farmer.
Multiple incidents of throwing things at people when she was angry.
Exactly. So now we get into second part of this, a little bit about my personal theories on artifact classification and theory. First and foremost, switching some things up, from all indications, from what I've observed, artifacts work on emotional connections. They work on emotion. They work on non-physical principles. If you happen to know the Ender's Game universe and you happen to know the concept of bilotics, it's actually really similar. There are actual connections between people. Artifacts kind of parallel that. They work on those connections. It's not really science. It's not really magic. It's motion. Motion lives in the world between science and magic. And then classifying artifacts is difficult. You can look at things based on how they're activated, how they, basically, back up, sorry. There are basically 4 different classifications of artifacts, if you really kind of back up and look at it. Number 1, tech artifacts. They're in the warehouse, but they don't really do anything. You've got Farnsworths, you've got Teslas. They're technology that the world shouldn't have, really, but they're not mystical, per se, like some of the others. And then you have artifacts that are simple activated. Anybody could activate it. Things like Claudia's little snow globe, things that you touch and it sets off, things that, similar things like that. And then you have complicated activation artifacts, artifacts that you have to do a series of things, or the stars have to be in a line, or you have to be a genius with math, or
you have to be a person with a military mindset prone to taking orders, and you happen to tap a telegraph in the museum.
Exactly. And then the fourth kind of other category is, it kind of transcends other things, it's area of effect. There are some artifacts that affect an area around you. You have, like the typewriter. Sylvia Plath's typewriter affects an area. The comb, to some extent, too, affects an area around you once you get it going. And then you have the subcategory of bifurcated artifacts. Artifacts in 2 pieces.
Or more.
Or more. Tea set. The tea set, the pen, the camera. Camera and the
Yeah, the camera and the projector.
Yeah. So anyway, that's a little bit about classifications and theories. And now, I figured have a little Q&A and discussion. Anything you think we missed? Anything you were wondering about? Favorite artifacts? Just like, raise your hand, yell at me. Person in the corner.
They did a lot of research then when they were doing the show.
Absolutely.
Did that carry over to the Warehouse 13 comics? I know they were the same writers, same head writers involved.
To be completely frank, I have not been able to see the comics, but I would assume so. They did a lot. They had to do a lot of research considering some of these obscure, crazy people. So I would assume that would be carrying over the comics as well, as long as it's the same writers.
Steve is an alpha?
We don't really know alphas that well.
Yeah.
Maybe not, who knows. That wasn't a crossover they really got much chance to explore, because they just kind of threw Lindsay Wagner onto alphas and said, oh, it's Dr. Calder.
Yeah. I mean, there are indications of people with various powers, I guess. You have Steve, you have Pete, you have Claudia, who can see an artifact being born, and she has an artifact sense. So possibly, I don't know.
Do you suppose artifacts are a similar principle to like a lot of concentration camps if you walk into them? so remarkably powerful that happened to that object or around that object that triggered it?
I would say so, yes. I mean, you can have, artifacts are made from a combination of an emotion and a moment and a person. And, you know, that is a powerful moment, and you're right, it is something that, you know, there's so much in that moment, whether it's passion or disgust or fear or whatever. It just creates this object, a part of the person, the part of the moment ends up in the object.
When it comes to all the really early artifacts, the ones before any real good records were kept, would it have been possible that way back then people just kind of accepted the fact that there were sometimes were objects that did mystical things and they were quote unquote gifts from the gods?
Oh, absolutely.
And that's probably why there's more registered artifacts now, because people aren't quite so, you know, who the gods are involved.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure pre-Warehouse 2, Egypt had its own repository of things that was in a temple or four that was that would be later known as artifacts.
Especially considering the warehouse didn't get to Egypt until the Ptolemaic era, which is after Egypt had the 1,000+ years of its own history.
Yeah, so, I mean, and you know, in some of the ancient artifacts, a lot of them had connections to religious moments, religious figures, etc.
But could those moments and figures have been triggered from the artifacts themselves? People found these objects or discovered these objects and were like, oh, maybe this is the cause of this object.
Absolutely.
It's the object that created the legend.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Anything else?
Yes. Do you have a favorite villain on the show?
To my eyes, the most effective villain is McPherson because he played everyone like a fiddle.
I wanted him back. Yes, true.
Yeah, my biggest problem with, I insist on calling him Evil Giles. My biggest problem with him is his plan required everybody else to be an idiot while he was in action, to some extent including himself, because if he of course knew what chemicals to ingest to avoid being drowned, why didn't he just do that in the 1500s? So his plan had too many holes in it. Artie was whammied, Helena was so emotionally screwed up that of course something was going to happen there. And with Sykes, it's just hard to tell how much of it was actually something he wanted to do and how much of it was bracelet-induced butthurt, basically. Yeah. It's like how much of it was the artifact acting on him, how much of it was...
What about Waldo?
Voldemort.
That was Crowley.
Nah.
I have to agree. I think McPherson was probably.
Back here.
I think McPherson was probably the most interesting and most effective, especially if you look at like how far back it goes, like all the way back to Joshua, and the like. She once had a theory that like half of everything could be traced back to McPherson trolling everybody from beyond the grave. So definitely most interesting, most effective, etc., etc., etc. Most destructive would be Sykes.
Yeah.
He actually makes you blow.
Because without Sykes, you don't have Artie being whammied evil, and without Artie being whammied evil, you don't have Evil Giles getting out of Bronze Sector.
No, his ass stays there.
I will say I was kind of disappointed with the cosmic reset button when I seen it.
It's the White House. Artifacts keep never happy to say you're sorry. All right. Yes.
What do you suppose the most dangerous of the artifacts is?
To be honest, I think, again, this goes back to the emotion. It depends on you. And not just you, but like, it depends on the person. Like, for example, Claudia were to tap the telegraph, shit all would happen. Claudia were to step in front of Sylvia Plath's typewriter, considering the connection she has with Sylvia Plath, she'd probably be gone much quicker than Pate. Actually, looking back to the spine, the people who lasted the longest with the spine were ex-military and a cop. The spine zotted people pretty damn quickly. So to some extent it depends on who you are and what combination of artifact. And frankly, I think there's shit in there that we don't know and we don't want to know, and I'm leaving it right up there.
I actually have a question.
Yeah.
So the first artifact, like, they never actually told the audience what it truly did.
You mean the trident?
No, not the trident. The one in the first episode.
Oh, the blood skull?
Yeah.
Yeah, they didn't really. You're right. They didn't really. It basically, it sent the guys psycho. My theory on what it did is it required a sacrifice to it, so it made the guy go out and try and kill somebody, basically, before it was neutralized. And it was just that crazy.
Like maybe it was not to sacrifice rituals, which is what made it into an artifact.
I'm sure that was true.
So maybe when it's activated, it's probably passive activation, just needs to be touched.
Well, he did prick his finger. It needs blood.
Yeah, but that's part of the
So,
sacrifice.
yeah. The blue hair?
I'm sort of branching away from like strictly artifacts and sort of into plot.
I don't
What's your opinion on how they sort of threw Micah and Pete together on the last episode?
Oh my. Okay.
I don't know about you, but I'm pretty upset.
Okay. Disclaimer here. I am not a bearing animal shipper. I am not anti-bearing animals. I am. My main ship is Joshua Steve. But anyway, I am not going to say Micah had to end up with Helen. However,
She couldn't
I-
end up with Pete. That's the
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah.
They're brother and sister.
exactly.
It's
The dynamic is
Ugh.
wrong.
No. I saw that pairing coming from miles away.
I know, but that's the thing.
Yeah.
The thing
It's
is,
like
like
should have drawn it out for 2.5 more seasons.
I thought Warehouse 13
This is not
was
supernatural.
over above the partners get together in the end trope. 'Cause
Yeah.
I thought it was better than that, and I'm like,
Yeah, it was like, there's finally like this great platonic ship, and then they just, nope, can't be platonic anymore.
Nope.
And really, the other big problem with the way they did it is they rushed into it so fast. It's just like, oh yeah, see, you guys totally like each other. You like each other. You like each other. You like each other. Oh, I like you. Oh.
But see,
I was just.
See, like, I kind of saw it coming, but at the same time, the way they were kind of spinning it, if they'd had another 3 seasons to draw it out, the way it should have happened was they would have gotten together, realized it wouldn't work, and then just stayed as platonic partners.
Yes.
That's what should have happened, but they didn't have the space, time, or resources.
They wanted to get them together, but they were afraid of moonlighting.
Yeah.
I just don't think they're a very good couple. They weren't better than Rose. Okay.
Best for TV is Clyde and Jinx.
Well,
Yes.
anything else? Plot, characters, stump fan. Yes.
This is really random, but in an episode where Jinx goes into the dark vault, as he's walking out, they show, before the commercial break, the ruby slippers, and they're clicking. Do you have any theories about why they might be in the dark vault?
Well, I mean, okay, going back to history, because this is what I think. The filming of The Wizard of Oz was fraught with a lot of problems. You had the first person who played the Tin Man actually ended up with mercury poisoning because the makeup was originally metal. Person who played the Wicked Witch got burned to high hell from one of the stunts. All of that, and also too, the ruby slippers are moving. The actual original books, they're silver. They switched them to ruby because because they were trying to showcase the Technicolor. So considering everything that happened in the filming of that movie, I don't think I want to know. They're probably creepy. But I can tell you they're probably not time travel. So. Anything else? Stump the panel, anything?
If there's one thing that you wished would be an artifact that wasn't already shown in the show, what would it be? Any one thing from history that you wish would be an artifact that wasn't already there?
John and Abigail Adams' letters.
Why?
I personally am an 18th century historian. I love the 18th century. John and Abigail Adams wrote the most amazing love letters to each other. They're actually racy, even to some extent by modern standards. And what they would probably do is they would basically love potion. A little creepy, but
What would be the dark side of that argument?
consent issues. Consent issues.
That's how Pete and Micah could have gotten together.
That is a tough question. I personally lean toward Pete Townsend's guitars because I can see him having at least two of them, one of which fills you with the impulse to smash your equipment. Another one, you can play things that are technically impossible for a human to play because a lot of Townsend's compositions cannot actually be played by humans, but the longer you use it, the deafer you get.
Did you have something?
Have you ever found any indication that Lovecraft actually had a key like that? Because I love Lovecraft and I love that episode, but I've never heard anything about that key before.
I am not, I don't know. As with a lot of the artifacts, it's plausible that it was, but probably not. So, I mean, obviously Lovecraft existed and he was a Greek book. But he probably didn't. There are a few artifacts that are actually known to, like Ben Franklin's life and rod. He had like a zillion. But like Frances Farmer's music box, I don't think she actually had a music box with a little spade all on it. I just can't see that.
So you didn't think the thimble was a thing either, huh?
I mean, Harriet Tubman had a number of thimbles. I know she did. She did a lot of sewing. But, it's kind of 6 of one, half dozen of another. So many things are either so obvious that, obviously everybody had one, or probably, or...
Well, there's never any real rhyme or reason to what becomes an artifact either. It's just an item that happens to be there.
So, anything? Last time. All right, guys. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
We enjoyed sharing this with